Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of our ongoing series, Is This Pilot Actually Good? Where we answer that question on pretty much a lot of different shows over the past several decades. We have a playlist on the channel if you want to check out some of our other videos in this series, but this time around, we are getting into the Big Bang Theory, which it's honestly... It's probably the last of the, super sitcom where you think, this show is probably on television at some random network at the very time that you're watching this.
Absolutely. This was a juggernaut of a show. It is really the last huge comedy that's out there.
It has inspired so much merchandise, huge streaming deals. All the actors made so much money
Oh my God.
playing these characters over 12 seasons. But we're going to focus mostly in on the pilot, the first episode, what works, what didn't, and ultimately in the end, is this pilot actually good? But before we get into it any further, if you do like this video, give us a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other updates we've got coming up.
Okay, so we like to start these by just talking about, the theme song and the opening credits. And does it work for this show? Now, originally, it sounds like they were going to use the song She Blinded Me with Science. And I'm really glad that they moved away from that, because now that you've seen the pilot, the only female character in this doesn't know anything about science. So this theme song really didn't match up at all. And the theme song they did end up putting together was perfect. I loved it. It was super catchy. Everybody knew all the words to it. I love that they had all the different flashes of all the different sort of science and history and all these things. It was awesome. And it still holds up.
It is still top-notch, one of the best theme songs of this era, especially because comedies in particular, we're in a spot where, networks only have 30 minutes, 22 without commercials to put a show on. A lot of people don't want to waste time on a theme song anymore, but it is kind of like, if you think about so many of the classic theme songs, they do have one. We've talked about Friends, and you think a lot about other shows that have been on over the years. WKRP, great example of this.
So good.
A good theme song could go a long way, and I think it helped to establish a sort of fun tone of the show where it is very nerdy and scientific, and they're throwing a lot at you. One of the things that I also like to talk about on here is sort of the pilot history lesson, because with the Big Bang Theory, it is fascinating. There is, and some of you may have already seen this, a pilot that is up on YouTube that is actually the original version of this show, because they tried a version of it, it did not work at all, and then they came back and sort of redeveloped it. Penny was not in the original pilot. It is very, very different. It is weird. It is not particularly good, even if Jim Parsons and Johnny Galecki are both there.
Yeah.
It feels kind of like, on some superhero shows, you have an Earth 2. It felt like that was like the Earth 2 Sheldon and Leonard.
Yeah, and I mean, where they actually ended up landing, it was a much better concept. We just did Game of Thrones, and it was the same sort of idea. There was another pilot that was made for that show that completely stunk, and it didn't end up going anywhere. And then they retooled it like they did here with Big Bang, and monster hit.
This is where we're going to get into the real discussion about the show now, because I feel like the Big Bang Theory is probably one of the most controversial, big hit shows over the past several decades, because it does have this sort of element to it where it is funny. It's got a lot of notable moments. It has a premise that I think is easy for people to digest. You go in and talk to network executive man, and he is like, what's the premise for your show? Give it to me in 30 seconds before I have Pilates or whatever else that he's got going on. And you have to basically say, okay, here it is. a woman shows up across the hall from two nerdy guys.
Yeah, and the idea of the boy who falls in love with the girl next door, this isn't a new concept. This has been on a million other shows. There's been a million love songs written about this, a million movies written about this. But this is even other, movies where it's sort of the nerdy guy next door that ends up with the pretty girl next door. I mean, this isn't original. But when you put in a bunch of nerds, there's not a lot of nerd content out there. There's a lot of reality shows that have been out there, like King of the Nerds or The Quest or Beauty and the Geek.
Yes.
But as far as scripted shows that are just focused on nerds, this is kind of the road.
And that's what makes this show interesting, because I do think The Big Bang Theory, from the pilot on, I think what makes the pilot so successful is it's exposing viewers who probably have never met anyone like Leonard or Sheldon to a very particular side of nerd culture, where there are people out there who are kind of like this. But on the flip side, they're dialing up these people to about a 12 or 13 out of 10, really, to the extent that I know for a lot of actual nerds out there, and I think we both classify ourselves as nerds, it felt like it went to a point where it wasn't actually an accurate representation of how nerds really are, and that led to this assumption that every nerd in real life, they are actually just like the characters on The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, I mean, I even had that experience with my friend's parents where they love The Big Bang Theory, and they were just like, oh yeah, all these, Sheldon and Leonard and whatever. And then I was the only nerd that they had ever met. So when I was like, really? Because when I first saw this pilot for the first time, I didn't enjoy it. And this is not our first time seeing it. This is, I think the third time or second time that I've seen it. But the first time I had seen it and I saw these characters, I was like, I don't know anybody like this. Like, Leonard was really the only character. I was like, yeah, okay, this makes sense. But these other characters, this isn't real. And this is the representation that's out there for nerds. And then my friend's parents are just like, oh yeah, they're like this. And so you're like this. I was just like, am I the only nerd you've ever met? So you think that this is what I'm like? Yes. Well, all right. So there it is. So they're bringing out this show that did end up reaching a group of people that had never met people like me, and now they think that this is what we're all like. It's a tricky place to be, because if you take that element out of it, the show is fun and the show is funny and the pilot is funny and there's a lot of cool stuff in there. But if you're a nerd like I am and have always been, when this show was first coming out, I was like, oh man, this is gonna be great. There's finally gonna be something out there for me, people like me doing stuff like me. And then as I was watching, I was just, the characters didn't speak to me, and a lot of them I was just kind of like, okay, Howard, I have never met a guy who thinks that he's a womanizer, that has that kind of womanizing confidence, whether he gets women or not, as a nerd, ever. I have met some guys that have a little bit of confidence as a nerd, but I've never met a nerd who's just like, hey, ladies. I was like, oh, right.
I probably have seen like Howard adjacent people, but never a full-on Howard. It's just the big central question with this show in a lot of ways is it celebrating nerds or is it skewering nerds? And I think they struggle to figure it out. And admittedly, as somebody who was on Beauty and the Geek, I think Beauty and the Geek struggles with this as well. Is it meant to poke fun so that we laugh at nerds, or are we laughing with the nerds? And I mean, I will say this. They do show characters who are successful in the sense that they will work as scientists, so they have good careers. They're not in the stereotype of they're all in their mother's basement eating Cheetos. They're like eating Indian food at one point, Thai food. They're a little bit more rounded in that sense. But then personality-wise, I've met like one person who I feel like was legitimately like Sheldon, and there were times when people said that I was like Sheldon in my life in the first couple years after this came out, and I was just like, come on. I'm totally Leonard if I'm anyone. I'm not Sheldon.
Well, that's the thing, and that is what this show ended up doing really right, is casting Johnny Galecki. And I say this as someone who, when I first heard that he was cast, I was like, come on. Because I loved him on Roseanne. He was like, back in my day, he was the super hot guy from Roseanne. So when I found out he was playing a nerd, I was like, you're going to put glasses on Johnny Galecki and call him a nerd? There's no way I'm going to believe in this, because he's just too good looking for this role. And it's interesting because if you look at Breaking Bad, the same thing happened to Aaron Paul. He almost didn't get that role because he was too good looking for the role. And you go back and watch Breaking Bad, could you imagine it without Aaron Paul? No. And it's the same with this show. I originally watched the pilot years and years and years and years ago, and I never watched any more for years until a lot of other people, of course, were talking about it, were working in TV, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to revisit this, because people were saying, my friends, nerdy friends, that it found its footing as it went on, and it moved a little bit away from how like in a box stereotype each character was, and it was because of Leonard. And as I got to watch it more, I saw less of hot guy Johnny Galecki, and he became Leonard, and it was really cool. And I know a lot of people love Sheldon, he's the star of the show, but I actually think that Leonard is the soul of this show, and he is why it works.
Especially in the early seasons. I really feel like Leonard is the reason why this concept ends up taking off. I know Sheldon has a lot of the sort of chewing the scenery moments and the big lines, but Leonard really is the heart of this show. And I'm someone who did continue to watch from the pilot on. I kind of fell off a little bit in like the later years of the show, mostly because I think The Big Bang Theory went on a little bit too long, but I feel like even in the pilot, Leonard has, to me, probably the funniest line of the entire episode when Penny is using their shower and she asked for a favor, and she's just tried to do the whole, you don't have to say yeah, but Leonard is basically just like, I'll probably say yes. And it's like, we have all probably been in that situation where we decide to say yes to a favor from someone who we're interested in, even if it is probably one of the worst things that it could imaginably be.
Yeah, and what I liked about that is that's a concept that isn't just for nerds.
Yeah.
Like, I've been there, you've been there, cool people have been there, everybody has been there when there's that person that they're interested in and they ask you for a really strange favor and you're like, all right, and this is going to end up with me with no pants on at somebody's house trying to get a TV back, but yeah, I'll do it.
Let's give the show a little bit of continuity praise here, because there are some things in the pilot that I think they hold on to really well for the entirety of the show. You have the concept of the elevator, which is broken for the entirety of it. I feel like there's a part of me that just thinks this is just a lazy production thing where they were like, okay, we need to have a way to establish exposition for all these episodes. Them standing in an elevator talking isn't good.
Yeah.
So we'll never fix the elevator, and they'll just circle it for like hundreds of episodes.
I love that.
Yeah, it worked. It's such a good sort of construct for the show. Yeah, this does not feel like a desirable place to live when they don't fix their elevator for over a decade, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, the jokes that the stairs, the bathroom, Sheldon's spot on the couch. I mean, the slapstick that kind of goes with him when she moves away from it and he's like jumping over the table and jumping on the couch. I mean, that's something that he's threaded throughout the entire series. And I love kind of that slapstick comedy. So I get why everybody likes Sheldon, and I love that stuff. That comedy still holds up.
Yeah, a lot of that I think works really, really well, and you can sort of look back at it and be like, okay, they at least knew what they were doing with some of this, but that doesn't mean The Big Bang Theory knew what they were doing with all of this at the time that the show first came out.
Yeah, we got to talk about that first scene where Leonard and Sheldon are at a particular type of bank to make a deposit. So this is something that didn't make any sense to me, even in the pilot. And as I saw more of the series, I was like, this is something Sheldon would never do. And even in the pilot, he's so very particular about things. I need my spot. It needs to be, we had Indian food already today. We cannot have Thai. There is a schedule to things and a routine to things, that the idea that he would go to this place to do this, I was like, no, like, your pilot set up that he would never do something like this. So I was a little bit right away kind of like, okay, all right. Maybe they don't exactly have their footing with him yet, but they're working on it.
The opening scene to me in general just doesn't age particularly well with the rest of the show. It just feels sort of so out of line with what I know about all of these characters. Because, yeah, I've never met a nerd who spends a lot of time trying to deposit their seed. Like, I've never met anyone who has had this experience, especially within the nerd world. I don't even think the scene with Leonard telling the woman, the receptionist, all the crosswords, like, that doesn't even feel like in character for Leonard either, that he would be like just kind of a tool and go over there and ruin this woman's experience of solving the crossword. That didn't work for me either. It feels like if you sort of just yank all of that out of the show, it's not needed. It doesn't actually teach you anything about the characters that we sort of know them to be. It just feels sort of like it was left over from whatever they were planning previously.
Yeah, and the other thing that really fell out for me with this whole deposit at the bank thing is just the idea that these two guys are so broke. They're so broke that they have to do this to get better internet. My best friend is a scientist. She, just like them, works in a lab and has for years, also has big student debt, works through a university, and she owns her own house in Toronto. So which is a very expensive place to live. So you've got now two scientists that work in labs the same as her, and they can barely afford their rent. They can't afford Wi-Fi, that they have to have a second thing to make money. Right away, I was kind of like, no. I know too many scientists to know that this isn't how it's working.
This is how I irrationally justify this for the majority of the series, and it's ridiculous because, yeah, right away with the pilot, it's weird that you have two professional scientists, even if they aren't the top tier scientists at that point, you are still probably getting a decent salary, and yet you are living in an apartment together. I know it's Pasadena, I know the rent can be expensive, but still, you're trying to say that, and you're also trying to say at the same time that Penny, who is a waitress at the Cheesecake Factory, can afford a one-bedroom apartment in
the same building.
Yeah, which I don't think is true, and so it is sort of this very weird disparity. I tried to think throughout a lot of the show's run because I'm sure the producers are just sort of like, well, we need these characters in close proximity, but maybe Sheldon is just really, really cheap, and maybe he's got a enormous savings account somewhere that justifies it. I don't know.
Yeah, I was actually waiting somewhere in the series, and I've seen the whole series, every single episode. I was waiting somewhere for them, and they didn't explain it, but they kind of brought it in when, by the time, I'm going to spoil it, that we had Penny and Leonard, and they were, on their way to getting married, living together, and they still had Sheldon living with them. That the idea of it was that they made enough money to live on their own. This is how I justified it. They made enough money to live on their own, but Sheldon couldn't live on his own. That for whatever reason, he just couldn't function on his own. And because Leonard's his best friend, he was just like, you know what, we'll rent this place and you can live with me. And that's how we'll live together, and that's how it works. But then I was always like, okay, well, why didn't they just buy a house then if they kind of thought they were going to be on their own like this? They have the money.
Yeah, it is something that if you spend a lot of time just sort of looking at it, they're basically just like, do not pay attention to the rent situation and just enjoy these people living next to each other and the hijinks they get into. Let's talk briefly about a few of the things that age kind of questionably from the pilot. MySpace reference number one at the top of the list. I do remember this came out in 2007. It came out right before I went on Beauty and the Geek, and MySpace was actually legitimately huge.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I totally remember being done with filming and checking my MySpace was one of the first things that I did. I definitely remember that, but it is weird hearing the word MySpace, watching it in 2020.
Yeah.
Howard Wolowitz, as a character, he's too creepy in the early going of the show. Doesn't really work. He eventually kind of evolves a little bit past it, but...
Yeah, Howard eventually evolves into a character that I ended up really liking a lot once they kind of... Because he was a character that I've never seen in real life. I've never seen a nerd that acts like that thinks that he can get women like that. So when I saw this character on the show, I was like, he's kind of creepy. This character doesn't exist to me in my world of nerds, and I'm 45. I've met a lot of nerds in my life. I've never met anyone close to him. So when they started to evolve him into less creepy, less of this womanizer, and more into this nerdy guy who he is inside, I was like, okay, now this character's getting really interesting.
Howard, I think, gets a good bit better over time. Not great in the early going, certainly not great in the pilot. This is a weird thing. Does anyone else remember Raj wearing a ball cap for a lot of the show? Because I really do not. I feel like that was just like, okay, this costume doesn't really work. I don't think they actually knew anything about Raj in the pilot other than that he doesn't speak to women. Because in the later seasons, I would say Raj is actually probably one of my favorite characters because he's the only person who actually still feels like he hasn't achieved his happy ending yet, and a lot of the other characters were sort of together. But I wish they had done more with him in the pilot. It's really surprising watching it now how small it really is in a lot of ways, because Howard and Raj are really only in a few minutes of it. Mm-hmm. All these other characters I think we think of as kind of synonymous with the show. You know, obviously Amy and Bernadette, they don't come around until later, but you know, Stuart, the comic book store owner, he's not in the pilot. A lot of the other recurring characters aren't here. It's very scaled down. But the question in the end is, of course, did this pilot actually work?
Yeah, and would you watch this pilot and watch the next episode? For me, the answer is no, I didn't. I watched the pilot originally, and I didn't watch any more of it for years. I was just like, nope. And that's because I went into this hoping that this was going to be a bit better nerd representation, because there wasn't anything like this. I had set the bar too high, I guess, in my mind, where I was like, oh man, this is finally happening for me. And then I saw it and I was just like, oh, okay, this is not really nerd representation. This is an exaggerated version of what cool people think nerds are, and now this is happening. So I was like, pass. I'm glad that later I went back to it and ended up watching the entire series, because it changed, and as it changed, it got really good.
Yeah, and I had an interesting experience where I said yes because I did keep watching after the pilot, where I watched the first several seasons pretty much straight through from start to finish, and I think it does have its fair share of problems along the way. I think, to me, once you get into like season 2, season 3, season 4, it really starts to find its stride a little bit. But I think ultimately a lot of the Big Bang Theory in general, pilot or the rest of the show, it's sort of about what you expect out of it, kind of like what you were saying, where if you expect to watch the Big Bang Theory to get just a full-on representation of nerd culture on television, it's not going to give you that. It's probably even going to at times make you upset, because it is stereotypical, over the top, and it at times paints nerds in a very weird, strange light. But if you're viewing it, I think, as a far above average sitcom with over-the-top characters and funny moments and really good actors, I think it definitely delivers on all of that. And I think in the end they have a good message for a lot of these characters, but the delivery of said message is troubled in the early going, to say the least.
Yeah.
All right, well, that concludes our edition of Is This Pilot Actually Good on The Big Bang Theory. But let us know your own experiences with the show, the pilot, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it in the comments. And if you do like this video, give us a like, subscribe, and you can support us further by checking the link in the description to the store. And we'll see you here next time.